The sun casts a warm glow over a peaceful beach town where Marcus, his wife Cheryl, and their two children Step are not aware of what is about to actually happen, and it will be freaking experience for them and will remove their laugh after some time. They've been waiting for this vacation for months, eager to escape the chaos of everyday life. Marcus, tall and calm, guides his family with a protective air, his every move careful, thoughtful. He's the rock of the family, always composed, never rattled. Cheryl, his wife, keeps the kids excited about the days ahead. They feel safe here, unaware that their perfect vacation is about to take a dark turn. Before we dive into the shocking events, hit like and subscribe to stay with us as this intense story unfolds. And let us know in the comments, where are you watching from? The sun was just beginning to rise higher in the sky, casting a golden hue over the quiet beach town as Marcus and his family strolled down the street. It was their second day of vacation, and today's plan was simple. Grab a few supplies from the local store and spend the afternoon by the water. Marcus held Cheryl's hand, their two kids, Jasmine and Elijah, skipping ahead, carefree and happy. There was a certain peace in the air, but Marcus, always sharp, couldn't shake the subtle tension he'd noticed since they arrived. The small general store wasn't far. It was a quaint building, a little rundown, with a faded sign and worn wooden steps that creaked as they walked inside. The air inside was cooler, and the scent of aged wood and dust filled the space. The store clerk, an older man with a weathered face, glanced up from behind the counter as they entered. His eyes lingered just a bit too long on Marcus and his family, a look that wasn't quite welcoming. Cheryl smiled at him politely, but the clerk didn't return the gesture. Instead, he went back to whatever he was doing, as if they weren't there. Marcus noticed. Of course he did. He noticed everything, even the things unsaid. He squeezed Cheryl's hand gently, letting her know he had it under control. The kids didn't seem to notice at first, too busy pointing out snacks they wanted and asking their parents for treats. But as they wandered the narrow aisles, Marcus could feel it, the quiet stares. It wasn't just the store clerk. A couple of customers, both locals by the looks of them, had stopped what they were doing to watch. It was subtle, but it was there, their eyes scanning Marcus, Cheryl, and the kids, as if they didn't quite belong. Marcus's chest tightened a little, but his face remained neutral. He'd learned long ago not to give people the satisfaction of knowing they were getting to him. Cheryl, however, could feel it too. Her smile was gone now, replaced with a quiet understanding. This wasn't just a small-town quirk. Something else was brewing. As the kids wandered ahead, Marcus and Cheryl moved down an aisle lined with canned goods, their pace slower now. Marcus reached for a can, just to busy his hands, when the sound of footsteps behind them made him freeze. Two figures appeared at the end of the aisle. Local police officers. Both men were tall, their uniforms neatly pressed, but it wasn't their appearance that caught Marcus's attention. It was the way they were looking at him, like they were waiting for him to make a wrong move, like they'd already decided something about him without a word being spoken. "Morning," one of the officers said, his voice flat, lacking any warmth or civility. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement, but didn't engage further. He could feel Cheryl tense beside him. The officers didn't walk away. Instead, they lingered, standing just close enough to make their presence known, but far enough to maintain a facade of normalcy. As Marcus and Cheryl moved down the aisle, picking up a few more items, the officers followed. It wasn't obvious, at least not if you weren't paying attention. But Marcus was. Their footsteps matched his, their eyes never leaving his family. It wasn't an outright confrontation, not yet, but it was clear what was happening. They were being watched, targeted. The kids, unaware of the tension building around them, giggled as they picked up a bag of chips, running over to show their parents. Jasmine's eyes sparkled with excitement, but even she began to notice the strange energy around them. "Daddy," she whispered, tugging on Marcus's sleeve. "Why are those men following us?" Marcus crouched down to her level, his voice calm, steady, despite the knot forming in his stomach. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Just stay close, okay?" He ruffled her hair gently, but inside he was simmering. He could feel Cheryl's unease too. She hadn't said anything, but her eyes were wide, her breathing a little quicker. The officers moved in closer, now standing just a few feet away as Marcus stood up. One of them, a younger man with a smug expression, leaned against the shelf, pretending to browse but clearly watching Marcus's every move. The other officer, older, with graying hair and a hardened look in his eyes, finally spoke again, this time with a hint of sarcasm in his voice. "You folks from around here?" Marcus kept his tone calm, not wanting to escalate the situation. "No, just on vacation," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Vacation, huh?" The older officer exchanged a glance with his partner, and for a moment, the store seemed to fall even quieter. The passive-aggressive tone wasn't lost on Marcus or Cheryl. The message was clear. You don't belong here. "We don't see many visitors like you around these parts," the younger officer added, his words dripping with thinly veiled contempt. Cheryl's jaw tightened, but Marcus gently placed a hand on her back, silently telling her to let it go. "Not here, not now." The kids, sensing the tension, clung to their mother's side. Elijah, the youngest, looked up at his father with wide eyes, not understanding, but knowing something was wrong. "Are we in trouble, Daddy?" he asked, his small voice filled with confusion. "No, buddy, we're just fine," Marcus said softly, though the anger was beginning to bubble beneath the surface. He kept his expression neutral, refusing to give the officers the satisfaction of knowing they were getting to him. But inside, his mind was racing. He had been in situations like this before. Situations where a simple interaction could spiral out of control. The officers continued to follow them through the store, never outright accusing them of anything, but their presence alone was enough to make Marcus feel cornered. It wasn't just the officers either. The store clerk, still at his post behind the counter, was watching with narrowed eyes as if waiting for something to happen. As they moved toward the checkout, the officers stayed close, their silence now more unsettling than their words. Cheryl placed their items on the counter, her movements stiff, her eyes flicking nervously toward the men behind them. Marcus handed over his credit card, his heart pounding in his chest, though he forced himself to remain outwardly calm. The store clerk swiped the card, his expression unreadable, but the tension in the air was palpable. Marcus glanced at the officers one last time, meeting their gaze head-on. He could feel the weight of their stares, the unspoken threat in the air. But he didn't back down. Not yet. "Have a nice day," the older officer said, his tone mocking as Marcus took the bags from Cheryl's hands. The family walked out of the store, the doorbell chiming behind them, but the unease clung to them like a shadow. As they made their way back to their car, Marcus felt the heavy weight of what had just happened settle on his shoulders. This vacation, meant to be an escape, was quickly turning into something else. Something much darker. He knew this wasn't over. Neither did they. Marcus and his family stepped out of the store, their bags in hand. The unsettling encounter with the police officers still lingered in the air, but Marcus, ever the protector, maintained his calm. He had been in tough situations before, and while this one gnawed at him, he knew keeping his composure was key. Cheryl walked beside him, her eyes scanning the street nervously. The children, now quieter, held on to their mother, sensing that something wasn't quite right. Just as they reached their car, the sound of footsteps approaching from behind caught Marcus's attention. He didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The same two officers from the store had followed them out, and now they were closing in. Marcus felt his chest tighten. The weight of what was coming began to press down on him. "Hey!" one of the officers shouted. Marcus stopped in his tracks, turning slowly to face them. The officer's face was set in a hard expression, a sneer curling at his lips. "We need to have a word with you." Cheryl's grip on Marcus's arm tightened. The kids huddled closer, their eyes wide with fear. Marcus raised his hand slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer's eyes darted to the bags in Marcus's hands. "We got a report of some stolen items from the store." His voice was filled with accusation, but the cold look in his eyes said more than the words ever could. This wasn't about theft. This was about something much deeper, much uglier. Marcus's heart sank, but he didn't let his face show it. He knew where this was going. "There must be some mistake. We paid for everything," he said, keeping his voice even, though he could feel the anger rising inside him. Cheryl stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "We have the receipt," she said, pulling it out of her pocket, her hands shaking as she unfolded it. The officers didn't bother looking at it. Instead, they stepped closer, their hands resting on their holsters in a way that was meant to intimidate. The taller officer, the one who had been watching them so closely inside, sneered at Marcus. "How about you stop talking and put your hands where we can see them?" Marcus felt the sting of injustice in every word. His mind raced, knowing that escalating the situation could only make things worse. But the humiliation, the blatant racism, made his blood boil. He took a slow breath, stepping in front of Cheryl and the kids, his body acting as a shield. "Look, officer, there's no need for this. We paid for everything. We're just trying to enjoy our vacation." The officer's sneer grew wider, his eyes darkening with a kind of twisted pleasure. "Yeah, well, we'll be the judge of that. Now hands up." Cheryl's voice broke through the tension, filled with panic. "This is a mistake. Please just look at the receipt. We didn't do anything wrong." But the officers weren't listening. The other officer, older and more grizzled, stepped forward and grabbed Marcus by the arm, yanking him back toward the squad car. "You're under arrest for theft," he said coldly, snapping handcuffs around Marcus's wrists. Cheryl's scream pierced the air. "No, you can't do this! He didn't do anything!" The children started crying, their small voices trembling with fear and confusion. Elijah clung to his mother's leg, sobbing uncontrollably, while Jasmine stood frozen, her wide eyes filled with terror as she watched her father being manhandled by the police. Marcus winced as the cuffs bit into his wrists, but he didn't resist. He kept his eyes on Cheryl, silently telling her to stay calm, though the pain in his heart was unbearable. He knew the trauma this would leave on his children, seeing their father, innocent, treated like a criminal. The officers didn't stop. They shoved Marcus toward the squad car, their expressions cold and devoid of empathy. "Typical," one of them muttered under his breath. "Think you can just stroll in here and take what you want?" The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the arrest. It was the deep-rooted hatred, the racism that dripped from every word, every gesture. This wasn't about a stolen item. There wasn't even one to begin with. This was about the color of his skin, the assumptions they had made the moment he walked into that store. Cheryl rushed forward, her face wet with tears, her voice breaking. "Please stop. This isn't right. We didn't do anything. You're scaring our children." But the officers ignored her. One of them pushed her back gently but firmly, as if her pleas didn't matter. "Ma'am, step back," the officer said without even looking at her, his tone cold and dismissive. Jasmine, still frozen in place, whispered, "Daddy?" Her voice was small, broken. Marcus turned his head slightly, his heart shattering at the sight of his little girl's tears. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be all right, but the words caught in his throat. He was powerless, handcuffed in front of his own family for a crime he didn't commit. The humiliation, the pain, the injustice, it was suffocating. As the officers shoved him into the back of the squad car, Marcus caught one final glimpse of his family. Cheryl standing there with tears streaming down her face, holding their sobbing children close. His mind was racing, filled with anger and pain. But through it all, he knew one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The door slammed shut and Marcus sat in the back of the car, his wrists aching from the cuffs, his heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The officers' voices echoed faintly in the front, but he didn't hear them. His thoughts were consumed by his family, his children's terrified faces, Cheryl's desperate pleas. He stared out the window, his mind racing with what he had to do next. This was more than just a wrongful arrest. This was a fight for his family's dignity, their humanity. He wouldn't let them take that away. In that moment, Marcus made a silent promise to himself. He would make sure they paid for this. The ride to the police station was quiet, but the silence felt heavy. Marcus sat in the back of the squad car, staring out the window, the landscape blurring by. His hands were cuffed tightly behind his back, but it wasn't the physical discomfort that weighed on him. It was the way his family had been torn apart in an instant. His kids crying, Cheryl pleading. It all played over and over in his mind, but he knew he had to keep it together. His calm demeanor didn't betray the storm brewing inside. He had been here before, not as a suspect, but as someone who knew how these things worked. The officers had no idea what they had just walked into. As the car pulled up to the station, the officers didn't say much. They opened the door and roughly pulled Marcus out, shoving him toward the entrance. He didn't resist. There was no point in fighting, at least not yet. He knew how these things worked. Let them think they had the upper hand. He'd wait. His time would come. The inside of the station was cold, sterile. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead as Marcus was led down a narrow hallway toward the holding cells. The officers barely looked at him, speaking to each other in low voices as if he wasn't even there. When they reached the cell, the older officer unlocked the door and shoved Marcus inside with little ceremony. The clang of the metal echoed through the small space as the door slammed shut behind him. Marcus stood there for a moment, surveying the room. It was small, barely big enough for the metal bench along one wall and a dirty toilet in the corner. The walls were gray and scratched, a clear indication of how many others had been through here before him. He sat down on the bench, leaning back against the cold wall, and took a slow, measured breath. They thought they had him, but they didn't know who he really was. Through the bars, Marcus could hear the faint voices of the officers in the station, laughing and talking as if arresting an innocent man was just another part of their day. Every now and then, he'd catch snippets of their conversation, and it didn't take long for their true colors to show. "I mean, you see that? Thinks he can just waltz in here like he's somebody," one of the officers muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Yeah, they always think there's something special, but we know how to handle them," the other officer replied, his tone laced with a kind of casual racism that made Marcus's stomach turn. These weren't just men doing their jobs. They were men enjoying the power they had over people like him. But Marcus stayed calm. He'd heard worse. He'd seen worse. Let them talk. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Back at home, Cheryl was frantic. She had wasted no time calling every lawyer she could think of, her voice shaky as she explained what had happened. But the system wasn't built for families like theirs. The legal process would take time. Time they didn't have. Every second Marcus spent in that cell felt like a lifetime to her, and the kids hadn't stopped crying since they left the store. Cheryl tried to comfort them, but she could barely keep herself together. She needed her husband back, and fast. In the station, the hours dragged on. The officers came and went, some barely glancing at Marcus, others giving him looks that were hard to read, part disdain, part curiosity. They didn't know what to make of him. A man like Marcus, sitting there so calmly, not fighting back, not causing a scene. It confused them. They expected him to lash out, to shout, to scream his innocence. But Marcus wasn't giving them the satisfaction. He was biding his time. One officer, younger than the rest, stood by the holding cell, staring at Marcus as if trying to figure him out. "You don't look too worried," he said, almost conversationally, though there was an edge to his voice. Marcus looked up, his expression unreadable. "Should I be?" he asked simply. The officer chuckled, though it was more of a sneer than anything else. "Well, most people in your position are." Marcus didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes. The officer lingered for a moment longer, as if expecting some kind of reaction. But when none came, he walked away frustrated. As the hours stretched on, the officers grew more comfortable, speaking freely in a way they wouldn't have if they'd known who Marcus really was. They made jokes, crude remarks, and every now and then, Marcus would hear a comment that made his blood boil. But he remained calm, his mind focused. He wasn't just sitting there waiting for nothing. He was waiting for the right moment. Meanwhile, Cheryl was still fighting, her phone glued to her ear as she pleaded with lawyer after lawyer. "Please, my husband didn't do anything. They arrested him for no reason. We have the receipt. We have proof," she said, her voice cracking with desperation. But the legal system moved at its own pace, and Cheryl was starting to feel like time was slipping away. She glanced at the kids who had finally fallen asleep, exhausted from crying. She had to stay strong for them. She had to get Marcus out. But with every passing minute, the weight of it all pressed down on her. Back at the station, Marcus had leaned back against the wall of his cell, closing his eyes for a moment. He could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, the occasional shuffle of footsteps, the murmur of voices in the distance. But he wasn't sleeping. His mind was sharp, his thoughts racing. He was running through every possibility, every angle. He'd been trained for situations like this, situations where the odds were stacked against him, where the system wasn't on his side. But he knew something the officers didn't. He wasn't just a man sitting in a cell. He was an FBI agent, trained, experienced, and with more power than any of them could imagine. And soon they would find that out. The tension in the station began to rise as the hours ticked by. Marcus knew it wouldn't be long now. He could feel it. The calm before the storm. He was just waiting for the right moment to reveal who he really was, to turn the tables on the men who had wrongfully arrested him. And when that moment came, everything would change. For now he waited, calm, collected, but ready. In that small, cold cell, surrounded by the sounds of a corrupt system, Marcus knew one thing for certain. Justice was coming, and it was coming soon. The hours in the holding cell stretched on, and Marcus remained calm, his mind ticking like a clock, waiting for the perfect moment. The officers had gotten comfortable, too comfortable. They assumed they had Marcus and his family pinned down, without any way to fight back. They didn't know who they were dealing with. Outside the cell, the officers chatted loudly, laughing among themselves, tossing casual, cutting remarks about Marcus and his family. Their voices echoed down the hallway, every word more demeaning than the last. Marcus had heard it all before, the kind of comments that tore at the very core of a person's dignity, but he had learned to keep his emotions in check. There was a bigger game at play here, and he was about to turn the tables in a way they wouldn't see coming. "Bet they're used to this," one officer snickered, his voice drifting through the air like poison. "Probably not their first run-in with the law." Another officer, the younger one from earlier, leaned against the door, shaking his head. "Why don't they just admit it? They think they're above the rules." Marcus sat on the metal bench, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his leg, his face unreadable. He could feel the tension rising, the time ticking closer to when he'd make his move. It wasn't rage or frustration that filled him. It was a quiet, calculated patience. The older officer, the one with the graying hair and hard eyes, stepped into view. He crossed his arms over his chest, smirking as he looked through the bars at Marcus. "You just don't learn, do you?" His tone was dripping with superiority, the kind of tone that told Marcus this wasn't just about law and order. This was personal, a power play. Marcus looked up slowly, meeting the officer's eyes. He didn't flinch, didn't react. "I don't know what you think you've got here, officer," Marcus said, his voice low and steady, "but you're making a big mistake." The officer chuckled, shaking his head. "Is that so? I don't think we're the ones making mistakes here." He glanced over at his partner, who laughed along with him. But there was something in Marcus's tone that made the officer hesitate, even for just a second. A flicker of doubt passed through his eyes, but he quickly buried it beneath his smug expression. Marcus stood up slowly, his presence in the room shifting. He walked toward the bars with a steady confidence that hadn't been there before, a quiet power that began to fill the space. The officers, so sure of themselves moments before, watched him, their laughter fading. He reached into his back pocket, pulling out his wallet in one smooth motion. The officers didn't react at first, thinking nothing of it, until Marcus opened the wallet and flashed something that made their faces go pale. It was his FBI badge. For a second, the entire room seemed to freeze, the weight of the revelation hanging in the air, like a hammer about to drop. The older officer's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer disbelief. His partner's eyes widened in shock, his face going pale as he stared at the badge, unable to process what he was seeing. "I'm Special Agent Marcus Taylor," Marcus said, his voice calm, but now carrying an undeniable authority. "FBI." The shock on the officers' faces was almost palpable. The older officer took a step back, his mouth opening and closing as if he was struggling to find words. His smug demeanor had crumbled in an instant, replaced by a dawning realization of just how deep a hole they had dug for themselves. "You," the younger officer stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "You're FBI?" Marcus nodded slowly, slipping the badge back into his pocket with a deliberate motion. "That's right. The older officer, his face now pale with panic, tried to regain his composure, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. We didn't know. I mean, this was just a routine check. Marcus cut him off with a single look, his calm demeanor now laced with a quiet, controlled anger. A routine check? He repeated, his voice soft but sharp. You call this a routine check? You arrested me, in front of my family, for a crime I didn't commit. You humiliated my wife, terrified my kids, and now you're standing here, making excuses? The officers were speechless, their confidence shattered. They glanced at each other, the full weight of what they had done crashing down on them. Marcus could see the fear in their eyes, the realization that their careers, their lives could be over in an instant. But he didn't let them off the hook that easily. He took a step closer to the bars, his voice lowering to a dangerous tone. Do you have any idea what you've just done? You think you can just arrest someone without cause, treat them like this, and walk away without consequences? The younger officer, now visibly trembling, tried to speak, but his words came out in a panicked rush. We didn't know you were... It doesn't matter what you knew, Marcus snapped, his calm facade cracking just enough to let his anger show. What matters is how you treated me and my family. You think your badge gives you the right to treat people like they're beneath you? The silence that followed was suffocating. The officers were paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do, what to say. Marcus let the silence stretch out, the tension in the room growing thicker by the second. Finally, Marcus stepped back, his calm demeanor returning, though the cold anger still simmered beneath the surface. Here's what's going to happen, he said quietly. You're going to apologize to my family. Then you're going to release me. And after that, we're going to have a conversation about the legal repercussions of what you've done. The officers nodded frantically, their earlier bravado gone. They scrambled to unlock the cell, their hands shaking as they fumbled with the keys. As soon as the door swung open, Marcus stepped out, his eyes never leaving the two men. But he didn't rush. He didn't need to. He had already won, and they knew it. The officers opened their mouths, stumbling over their words as they tried to apologize. But Marcus silenced them with a raised hand. Save it, he said, his voice hard. We'll deal with the apologies later. Right now, you're going to fix this. They nodded again, too afraid to argue, too shaken to do anything but comply. Marcus walked out of the holding area, his steps slow and measured, leaving the officers behind to deal with the weight of what they had done. But even as he left the room, the tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, a reminder of just how close they had come to losing everything. And Marcus wasn't done with them yet. As Marcus stepped out of the holding cell, the officers scrambled to follow him, their faces pale and filled with regret. The confidence they'd had earlier had completely drained away, replaced by a sense of dread that clung to them like a dark cloud. They knew they had messed up, big time. Marcus didn't rush. He walked with a calm, deliberate pace, every step radiating control. The power had shifted, and now it was clear who was in charge. The officers, who had been so smug just hours ago, were now stumbling over themselves, desperate to make things right. Outside, Cheryl stood with the kids, her arms wrapped protectively around them. The fear and panic from earlier had morphed into a simmering anger. She looked at Marcus as he approached, her eyes wide with a mix of relief and outrage. The children, still shaken, clung to her side, watching everything with wide, tear-streaked eyes. Marcus stopped in front of his family, turning to the officers. His voice was low, but the authority in it was unmistakable. Apologize, and he said simply. The officers hesitated, their faces twisting in shame. They glanced at each other, knowing there was no escaping this. We're sorry, the older officer stammered, his voice barely audible. We made a mistake. Cheryl's eyes burned with fury. A mistake, she snapped. You humiliated us. In front of our children. You think that's just a mistake? The younger officer, his hands trembling, stepped forward. We didn't know. We didn't realize. It doesn't matter what you knew. Marcus cut him off, his voice icy. What matters is how you treated my family. You think an apology is enough to fix this? The officers looked like they wanted to sink into the ground. their regret clear in every line of their faces. They had crossed a line and they knew it, but the damage was done. No words could take back the fear and humiliation Marcus and his family had been through. Cheryl's voice cracked as she spoke, her anger now mixed with relief. "Let's just go, Marcus. Let's get out of here." But before Marcus could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A call from his FBI superior. He hesitated for a moment before answering, stepping away from his family to take the call. "Agent Taylor," came the voice on the other end, crisp and professional. "I heard what happened. Are you all right?" Marcus nodded, though the weight of the situation still hung over him. "We're fine," he said, his voice steady. "But I'm guessing this isn't a social call." "No," his superior replied, the tone shifting to something more serious. "I wanted to let you know, the officers who arrested you, they've been on our radar for a while. Your arrest wasn't just bad luck. It was part of a larger pattern we've been investigating." Marcus's eyes narrowed as the pieces fell into place. This wasn't just a random act of racism. It was part of something bigger, an investigation into corruption within the local law enforcement. And somehow his arrest had tied into that. The twist hit him hard, but Marcus kept his cool. "So this was all connected?" he asked, his mind already working through the implications. "Looks like it," his superior confirmed. "We've got more work to do, but you've already helped us expose part of the problem." Marcus hung up the phone, his mind racing. What had started as a personal nightmare had now become part of something much larger. An investigation that would bring justice not just for him, but for others as well. As he turned back to Cheryl, he knew one thing for sure. This fight wasn't over yet. As Marcus finished his call, a new sense of purpose settled over him. This wasn't just about his family anymore. It was bigger than that. For months, he had been quietly gathering evidence on corrupt law enforcement in small towns just like this one. His work had been under the radar, each step careful, each decision calculated. The officers who had arrested him didn't realize that their actions had just sped up their own downfall. He turned to face them, his expression calm but filled with a quiet power that made the officers uneasy. They were already on edge from the revelation that Marcus was FBI, but they had no idea just how deep they were in. "I've been watching your department for months," Marcus said, his voice steady. He didn't need to raise it. The weight of his words did all the work. Corruption, abuse of power, racial profiling, all of it. And today you gave me exactly what I needed to finish the case. The officers' faces went pale. The older one, who had been so smug before, suddenly looked as though the ground had been ripped out from beneath him. His partner's eyes darted around the room, as if looking for a way out. "What are you talking about?" the older officer stammered, but his voice had lost its confidence. "This is just a misunderstanding." Marcus didn't flinch. He took a slow step toward them, his presence commanding. "You think this is just about me? It's not. This is about all the people you've wronged, all the families you've hurt. You thought you could get away with it because no one was watching, but I've been watching, and now the whole world is about to see who you really are." The officers exchanged a panicked glance, and in that moment, Marcus saw it. The fear, the realization that they were no longer in control. The younger officer, clearly shaken, took a step backward, his hand twitching toward his radio. He was thinking about running. Marcus could see that, but there was nowhere to go. "Don't even think about it," Marcus said sharply, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "It's too late for that." As if on cue, Marcus pulled out his phone again, dialing a number with practiced ease. He waited only a moment before speaking. "Agent Taylor, send the team in." The words were simple, but their effect was immediate. The officers looked like they had been struck. They knew what was coming now. Backup, real FBI agents. And there was no way to talk their way out of this. The panic in the room was palpable. The older officer's face turned red with desperation. "You can't do this," he shouted, his voice cracking under the pressure. "We'll lose everything." Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. "You should have thought about that before you abused your power." At that moment, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Cheryl, still holding their children close, stepped forward, her eyes never leaving Marcus. There was something in her expression, relief mixed with the weight of everything they had been through. She had trusted him, and now justice was on its way. It didn't take long for the backup to arrive. Within minutes, the station was flooded with FBI agents, their presence casting a new, undeniable authority over the room. The corrupt officers were cornered, their backs against the wall as the agents moved in, swift and professional. "Hands where we can see them," one of the agents barked, his voice commanding. The younger officer, his hands shaking, raised them slowly, his eyes wide with terror. The older officer resisted for a moment, but as soon as the agent stepped closer, his defiance crumbled. He let out a strangled sigh, his shoulders slumping in defeat as he, too, raised his hands. Cheryl's eyes filled with tears as she watched, not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of what was happening. Justice. Real justice. Her children, still clutching at her, looked on in awe as the very men who had torn their family apart were now the ones in handcuffs. Marcus stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it, not just for himself, but for his family, and for all the others who had suffered under this corrupt system. The agents moved swiftly, arresting the officers and leading them out of the station, their faces blank with shock. The irony of the scene wasn't lost on anyone. Only hours earlier, it had been Marcus being led away in handcuffs, his family watching helplessly. Now the tables had turned, and justice had been served. Cheryl wiped at her eyes, her voice trembling with emotion as she spoke to Marcus. "I can't believe it's over." Marcus turned to her, his expression softening for the first time since this nightmare had begun. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and for a moment, the weight of everything finally lifted. "It's over," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're okay now." The children, still holding on to Cheryl, looked up at their father, their eyes filled with both fear and awe. Jasmine, the older of the two, spoke first, her voice small but steady. "Daddy, you're a hero." Marcus smiled, though his heart ached with everything they had been through. "No, sweetheart," he said gently. "I'm just doing what's right." As the officers were led away, the family stood together, united. The air felt lighter now, the tension that had hung over them for hours finally breaking. Marcus glanced back toward the station, knowing this wasn't just about their family. It was about making sure this never happened again. The audience could feel the weight of the moment, the emotional impact of justice being done. Marcus had not only taken down the corrupt officers, but had also shown the world what it meant to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. And as the sun began to set on that small town, Marcus knew that this was only the beginning. The air felt different now, lighter, as Marcus, Cheryl, and their children finally stepped out of the police station. The ordeal was over, and though the weight of what they had just experienced still lingered, there was relief. Cheryl took a deep breath, looking up at Marcus with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "I don't know how you stayed so calm," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. Marcus smiled gently, wrapping an arm around her. "I had to. For you and the kids," he replied, his voice steady, though the storm inside him hadn't fully settled. Jasmine and Elijah, who had been so scared before, now looked at their father with awe. "Daddy, you're so brave," Jasmine whispered, holding his hand tightly. Marcus bent down, looking into his children's eyes, his heart swelling with love. "I just did what I had to do. And remember, it's always important to stand up for what's right." The family walked down the quiet street, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. The vacation they had hoped for was finally back on track, but the experience had left its mark. Cheryl leaned into Marcus, her voice tinged with sadness. "It shouldn't have happened in the first place." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "You're right. But this is why we can never be silent. Even in peaceful places, injustice can find its way in. We have to stay vigilant, always." As they continued on, stronger as a family, Marcus couldn't help but reflect on the reality they had just faced. A reminder that even in a quiet town, the shadow of racial prejudice can still loom. If you enjoyed watching, please do like and subscribe and comment your opinions. Thank you.